everybody. Today we are going to start with the first chapter of the next book we're reading for this month, technically April. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And that is by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. I'm really excited about this one. I started it yesterday and I think y'all are going to love it as much as I do, and I've already learned so much. So I'm going to go ahead and read the first chapter to you, and you can listen if you would like to, or kind of fast forward through that. And then I will discuss some of my thoughts, and in the show notes, and the description, I will put my key points, things I highlighted, any definitions that I had to look up because I didn't know what the word meant, as well as some things that I thought would be excellent for journal prompts, or things to bring to our communities and discuss further. All right, so let's get started. Defining racism. Can we talk? Early in my teaching career, a white student I knew asked me what I would be teaching the following semester. I mentioned that I would be teaching a course on racism. She replied with some surprise in her voice, "Is there still racism?" I assured her that indeed there was, and suggested that she sign up for my course. Years later, after exhaustive media coverage of events such as the Trayvon Martin shooting, the Ferguson unrest, and the Department of Justice report on the Ferguson Police Department, the Charleston Church Massacre, the Walter Scott trial, the appeal to racial prejudices in electoral politics, and the bitter debates about affirmative action and immigration reform, it seems hard to imagine that anyone would still be unaware of the reality of racism in our society. But in fact, in almost every audience I address, there is someone who suggests that racism is a thing of the past. There is always someone who hasn't noticed the stereotypical images of people of color in the media, who hasn't observed the housing discrimination in their community, who hasn't read the newspaper articles about documented racial bias and lending practices among well-known banks, who isn't aware of the racial tracking pattern at the local school, who hasn't seen the reports of rising incidents of racially motivated hate crimes in America. In short, someone who hasn't been paying attention to issues of race. But if you are paying attention, the legacy of racism is not hard to see, and we are all affected by it. The impact of racism begins early. Even in our preschool years, we are exposed to misinformation about people different from ourselves. Many of us grew up in neighborhoods where we had limited opportunities to interact with people different from our own families. When I ask my audiences, how many of you grew up in neighborhoods where most of the people were from the same racial group as your own? Almost every hand goes up. There is still a great deal of social segregation in our communities. Consequently, most of the early information we receive about others, people racially, religiously, or socioeconomically different from ourselves, does not come as the result of firsthand experience. The secondhand information we do receive has often been distorted, shaped by cultural stereotypes, and left incomplete. Some examples will highlight this process. When I was teaching at Mount Holyoke College, one of my students conducted a research project investigating preschoolers' conceptions of Native Americans. Using children at a local daycare center as her participants, she asked these 3- and 4-year-olds to draw a picture of a Native American. Most children were stumped by her request. They didn't know what a Native American was. But when she rephrased the question and asked them to draw a picture of an Indian, they readily complied. Almost every picture included one central feature: feathers. In fact, many of them also included a weapon, a knife, or a tomahawk, and depicted the person in violent or aggressive terms. Though this group of children, almost all of whom were white, did not live near a large native population, and probably had had little, if any, personal interaction with American Indians, they all had internalized an image of what Indians were like. How did they know? Cartoon images, in particular of the Disney movie Peter Pan, were cited by the children as their number one source of information. At the age of 3, these children already had a set of stereotypes in place. Though I would not describe 3-year-olds as prejudiced, the stereotypes to which they have been exposed become the foundation for the adult prejudices so many of us have. Sometimes the assumptions we make about others come not from what we have been told or what we have seen on television or in books, but rather from what we have not been told. The distortion of historical information about people of color leads young people, and older people too, to make assumptions that may go unchallenged for a long time. Consider this conversation between 2 white students following a discussion about the cultural transmission of racism. "Yeah, I just found out that Cleopatra was actually a black woman." "What?" The first student went on to explain the source of her newly learned information. The second student exclaimed in disbelief, "That can't be true. Cleopatra was beautiful." While scholars still argue the question of Cleopatra's ancestry, what is most important in this example is what this young woman had learned about who in our society is considered beautiful and who is not. Had she conjured up images of Hollywood icon Elizabeth Taylor when she thought of Cleopatra? The new information her classmate had shared and her own deeply ingrained assumptions about who is beautiful and who is not were too incongruous to allow her to assimilate the information at that moment. Omitted information can have similar effects. For example, another young woman preparing to be a high school English teacher expressed her dismay that she had never learned about any Black authors in any of her English courses. How was she to teach about them to her future students when she hadn't learned about them herself? A white male student in the class responded to this discussion with frustration in his response journal, writing, quote, "It's not my fault that Blacks don't write books," end quote. Had one of his elementary, high school, or college teachers ever told him that there were no Black writers? Probably not. Yet because he had never been exposed to Black authors, he had drawn his own conclusion that there were none. Stereotypes, omissions, and distortions all contribute to the development of prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information. I assume that we all have prejudices, not because we want them, but simply because we are so continually exposed to misinformation about others. Though I have often heard students or workshop participants describe someone as not having, quote, "a prejudiced bone in his body," end quote, I usually suggest they look again. Prejudice is one of the inescapable consequences of living in a racist society. Cultural racism, the cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color, is like smog in the air. Sometimes it is so thick it is visible. Other times it is less apparent. But always, day in and day out, we are breathing it in. None of us would introduce ourselves as smog breathers, and most of us don't want to be described as prejudiced. But if we live in a smoggy place, how can we avoid breathing the air? If we live in an environment in which we are bombarded with stereotypical images in the media, are frequently exposed to the ethnic jokes of friends and family members, and are rarely informed of the accomplishments of oppressed groups, we will develop the negative categorizations of those groups that form the basis of prejudice. People of color as well as whites develop these categorizations. Even a member of the stereotyped group may internalize the stereotypical categories about his or her own group to some degree. In fact, this process happens so frequently that it has a name: internalized oppression. Some of the consequences of believing the distorted messages about one's own group will be discussed in subsequent chapters. Certainly, some people are more prejudiced than others, actively embracing and perpetuating negative and hateful images of those who are different from themselves. When we claim to be free of prejudice, perhaps what we are really saying is that we are not hate mongers, but none of us is completely innocent. Prejudice is an integral part of our socialization, and it is not our fault. Just as the preschoolers my student interviewed are not to blame for the negative messages they internalized, we are not at fault for the stereotypes, distortions, and omissions that shaped our thinking as we grew up. To say that it is not our fault does not relieve us of responsibility, however. We may not have polluted the air, but we need to take responsibility, along with others, for cleaning it up. Each of us needs to look at our own behavior. Am I perpetuating and reinforcing the negative messages so pervasive in our culture, or am I seeking to challenge them? If I have not been exposed to positive images of marginalized groups, am I seeking them out, expanding my own knowledge base for myself and my children? Am I acknowledging and examining my own prejudices, my own rigid categorizations of others, thereby minimizing the adverse impact they might have on my interactions with those I have categorized? Unless we engage in these and other conscious acts of reflection and re-education, we easily repeat the process with our children. We teach what we are taught. The unexamined prejudices of the parents are passed on to the children. It is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to interrupt this cycle. Racism, a system of advantage based on race. Many people use the term prejudice and racism interchangeably. I do not, and I think it is important to make a distinction. In his book, Portraits of White Racism, David Wellman argues convincingly that limiting our understanding of racism to prejudice does not offer a sufficient explanation for the persistence of racism. He defines racism as a, quote, system of advantage based on race, end quote. In illustrating this definition, he provides example after example of how whites defend their racial advantage: access to better schools, housing, jobs, even when they do not embrace overtly prejudicial thinking. Racism cannot be fully explained as an expression of prejudice alone. This definition of racism is useful because it allows us to see that racism, like other forms of oppression, is not only a personal ideology based on racial prejudice, but a system involving cultural messages and institutional policies and practices, as well as the beliefs and actions of individuals. In the context of the United States, the system clearly operates to the advantage of whites and to the disadvantage of people of color. Another related definition of racism, commonly used by anti-racist educators and consultants, is prejudice plus power. Racial prejudice combined with social power, access to social, cultural, and economic resources and decision-making, leads to the institutionalization of racist policies and practices. Well, I think this definition also captures the idea that racism is more than individual beliefs and attitudes. I prefer Wellman's definition because the idea of systematic advantage and disadvantage is critical to an understanding of how racism operates in American society. In addition, I find that many of my white students and workshop participants do not feel powerful. Defining racism as prejudice plus power has little personal relevance. For some, their response to this definition is the following. Quote, "I'm not really prejudiced and I have no power, so racism has nothing to do with me," end quote. However, most white people, if they are really being honest with themselves, can see that there are advantages to being white in the United States. Despite the current rhetoric about affirmative action and reverse racism, every social indicator from salary to life expectancy reveals the advantages of being white. The systematic advantages of being white are often referred to as white privilege. In a now well-known article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, Peggy McIntosh, a white feminist scholar, identified a long list of societal privileges that she received simply because she was white. She did not ask for them, and it is important to note that she hadn't always noticed that she was receiving them. They included major and minor advantages. Of course, she enjoyed greater access to jobs and housing, but she also was able to shop in department stores without being followed by suspicious salespeople and could always find appropriate hair care products and makeup in any drugstore. She could send her child to school confident that the teacher would not discriminate against him on the basis of race. She could also be late for meetings and talk with her mouth full, fairly confident that these behaviors would not be attributed to the fact that she was white. She could express an opinion in a meeting or in print and not have it labeled the white viewpoint. In other words, she was more often than not viewed as an individual rather than a member of a racial group. This article rings true for most white readers, many of whom may have never considered the benefits of being white. It's one thing to have enough awareness of racism to describe the ways that people of color are disadvantaged by it, but this new understanding of racism is more elusive. In very concrete terms, it means that if a person of color is the victim of housing discrimination, the apartment that would otherwise have been rented to that person of color is still available for a white person. The white tenant is, knowingly or unknowingly, the beneficiary of racism, a system of advantage based on race. The unsuspecting tenant is not to blame for the prior discrimination, but she benefits from it anyway. For many whites, this new awareness of the benefits of a racist system elicits considerable pain, often accompanied by feelings of anger and guilt. These uncomfortable emotions can hinder further discussion. We all like to think that we deserve the good things we have received and that others too get what they deserve. Social psychologists call this tendency a belief in a just world. Racism directly contradicts such notions of justice. Understanding racism as a system of advantage based on race is an antithetical to traditional notions of an American meritocracy. For those who have internalized this myth, this definition generates considerable discomfort. It is more comfortable simply to think of racism as a particular form of prejudice. Notions of power or privilege do not have to be addressed when our understanding of racism is constructed in that way. The discomfort generated when a systemic definition of racism is introduced is usually quite visible in the workshops I lead. Someone in the group is usually quick to point out that this is not the definition you will find in most dictionaries. I reply, "Who wrote the dictionary?" I am not being facetious with this response. Whose interests are served by a prejudice-only definition of racism? It is important to understand that the system of advantage is perpetuated when we do not acknowledge its existence. Racism, for whites only? Frequently, someone will say, "You keep talking about white people. People of color can be racist too." I once asked a white teacher what it would mean to her if a student or parent of color accused her of being racist. She said she would feel as though she'd been punched in the stomach or called a low-life scum. She is not alone in this feeling. The word racist holds a lot of emotional power. For many white people, to be called racist is the ultimate insult. The idea that this term might only be applied to whites becomes highly problematic, for after all, can't people of color be, quote, low-life scum, end quote, too? Of course, people of any racial group can hold hateful attitudes and behave in racially discriminatory and bigoted ways. We can all cite examples of horrible hate crimes that have been perpetrated by people of color as well as whites. Hateful behavior is hateful behavior, no matter who does it. But when I am asked, can people of color be racist? I reply, the answer depends on your definition of racism. If one defines racism as racial prejudice, the answer is yes. People of color can and do have racial prejudices. However, if one defines racism as a system of advantage based on race, the answer is no. People of color are not racist because they do not systematically benefit from racism. And equally important, there is no systematic cultural and institutional support or sanction for the racial bigotry of people of color. In my view, reserving the term racist only for behaviors committed by whites in the context of a white-dominated society is a way of acknowledging the ever-present power differential afforded whites by the culture and institutions that make up the system of advantage and continue to reinforce notions of white superiority. Using the same logic, I reserve the word sexist for men. Though women can and do have gender prejudices, only men systematically benefit from sexism. Despite my best efforts to explain my thinking on this point, there are some who will be troubled, perhaps even incensed, by my response. To call the racially motivated acts of a person of color acts of racial bigotry, and to describe similar acts committed by whites as racist, will make no sense to some people, including some people of color. To them, I respectfully say, we can agree to disagree. At moments like these, it is not agreement that is essential, but clarity. Even if you don't like the definition of racism I am using, hopefully you are now clear about what it is. If I also understand how you are using the term, our conversation can continue despite our disagreement. Another provocative question I'm often asked is, are you saying all whites are racist? When asked this question, I again remember that white teacher's response, and I'm conscious that perhaps the question I'm really being asked is, are you saying all whites are bad people? The answer to that question is, of course not. However, all white people, intentionally or unintentionally, do benefit from racism. A more relevant question is, what are white people as individuals doing to interrupt racism? For many white people, the image of a racist is a hood-wearing Klan member or a name-calling Archie Bunker figure. These images represent what might be called active racism, blatant, intentional acts of racial bigotry and discrimination. Passive racism is more subtle and can be seen in the collusion of laughing when a racist joke is told, letting exclusionary hiring practices go unchallenged, accepting as appropriate the omissions of people of color from the curriculum, and avoiding difficult race-related issues. Because racism is so ingrained in the fabric of American institutions, it is easily self-perpetuating. All that is required to maintain it is to go about business as usual. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior is identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So, not all whites are actively racist. Many are passively racist. Some, though not enough, are actively anti-racist. The relevant question is not whether all whites are racist, but how can we move more white people from a position of active or passive racism to one of active anti-racism? The task of interrupting racism is obviously not the task of whites alone, but the fact of white privilege means that whites have greater access to the societal institutions in need of transformation. To whom much is given, much is required. It is important to acknowledge that while all whites benefit from racism, they do not all benefit equally. Other factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, age, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, and mental and physical ability also play a role in our access to social influence and power. A white woman on welfare is not privileged to the same extent as a wealthy white heterosexual man. In her case, the systematic disadvantages of sexism and classism intersect with her white privilege, but the privilege is still there. This point was brought home to me in a study conducted by one of my Mount Holyoke graduate students, Phyllis Wentworth. Wentworth interviewed a group of female college students who were both older than their peers and the first members of their families to attend college about the pathways that led them to college. All of the women interviewed were white, from working class backgrounds, and from families where women were expected to graduate from high school and get married or get a job. Several had experienced abusive relationships and other personal difficulties prior to coming to college, yet their experiences were punctuated by good luck stories of apartments obtained without a deposit, good jobs offered without experience or extensive reference checks, and encouragement provided by willing mentors. While the women acknowledged their good fortune, none of them discussed their whiteness. They had not considered the possibility that being white had worked in their favor and helped give them the benefit of the doubt at critical junctures. This study clearly showed that even under difficult circumstances, white privilege was still operating. It is also true that not all people of color are equally targeted by racism. We all have multiple identities that shape our experience. I can describe myself as a light-skinned, well-educated, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian African-American woman raised in a two-parent middle-class family in a small, predominantly white middle-class town. As an African-American woman, I am systematically disadvantaged by race and by gender, but I systematically receive benefits in other categories, which then mediate my experience of racism and sexism. When one is targeted by multiple isms, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, anti-Semitism, ageism, in whatever combination, the effect is intensified. The particular combination of racism and classism in many communities of color is life-threatening. Nonetheless, when I, the middle-class black mother of two sons, read another story about a black man's unlucky encounter with a white police officer, and his deadly force, I know that racism by itself can kill. I was reminded of this fact once again by Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of Between the World and Me, when he captures the heart-wrenching pain of Dr. Jones, whose 23-year-old son Prince Jones was killed by police during a traffic stop. Her socioeconomic success as prominent physician and the cultural and educational advantages she was able to provide for her son throughout his life could not protect him. She said, "I spent years developing a career, acquiring assets, engaging responsibilities, and one racist act. It's all it takes." The cost of racism. Early in my teaching career, a white male student in my Psychology of Racism course wrote in his journal at the end of the semester that he had learned a lot about racism and now understood in a way he never had before just how advantaged he was. He also commented that he didn't think he would do anything to try to change the situation. After all, the system was working in his favor. Fortunately, his response was not typical. Most of my students left my course with the desire and an action plan to interrupt the cycle of racism. However, this young man's response did raise an important question. Why should whites who are advantaged by racism want to end that system of advantage? What are the costs of that system to them? In the late 1980s, a Money magazine article called Race and Money chronicled the many ways the American economy was hindered by institutional racism. 30 years later, the analysis still rings true. Whether one looks at productivity lowered by racial tensions in the workplace, or real estate equity lost through housing discrimination, or the tax revenue lost in underemployed communities of color, or the high cost of warehousing human talent in prison, the economic costs of racism are real and measurable. As a psychologist, I often hear about the less easily measured costs. When I ask white men and women how racism hurts them, they frequently talk about their fears of people of color, the social incompetence they feel in racially mixed situations, the alienation they've experienced between parents and children when a child marries into a family of color, and the interracial friendships they had as children that were lost in adolescence or young adulthood without their ever understanding why. White people are paying a significant price for the system of advantage. The cost is not as high for whites as it is for people of color, but a price is being paid. Wendell Berry, a white writer raised in Kentucky, captures the psychic pain in the opening pages of his book, The Hidden Wound. If white people have suffered less obviously from racism than black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater perhaps than we can yet know. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or as a member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge it or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society. The dismantling of racism is in the best interests of everyone. A word about language. Throughout this book, I have used the term white to refer to Americans of European descent. In another era, I might have used the term Caucasian. I have used the term people of color to refer to those groups in America that are and have been historically targeted by racism. This includes people of African descent, people of Asian descent, people of Latin American descent, and indigenous peoples, sometimes referred to as Native Americans or American Indians. Many people refer to these groups collectively as non-whites. This term is particularly offensive because it defines groups of people in terms of what they are not. Do we call women non-men? I also avoid using the term minorities because it represents another kind of distortion of information that we need to correct. So-called minorities represent the majority of the world's population. While the term people of color is inclusive, it is not perfect. As a workshop participant once said, white people have color too. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say people of more color, though I am not ready to make that change. Perhaps fellow psychologist Linda James Myers is on the right track. She refers to two groups of people, those of acknowledged African descent and those of unacknowledged African descent, reminding us that we can all trace the roots of our common humanity to Africa. I refer to people of acknowledged African descent as Black. I know that African American is also a commonly used term, and I often refer to myself and other Black people born and raised in America in that way. Perhaps because I am a child of the 1960s, Black and beautiful era, I still prefer Black. The term is more inclusive than African American because there are Black people in the United States who are not African American, Afro-Caribbeans, for example, yet are targeted by racism and are identified as Black. I capitalize both Black and white because I use them synonymously with other terms that are always capitalized, such as African American and European American. When referring to other groups of color, I try to use the terms that the people themselves want to be called. In some cases, there is no clear consensus. For example, some people of Latin American ancestry prefer Latino, while others prefer Hispanic, or, if of Mexican descent, Chicano. In the past, I have preferred to use Latino or Latina rather than Hispanic. In this edition, I'm choosing to use the more recent term, Latinx, because it is a gender-inclusive term that encompasses everyone, men, women, and those who identify as transgender or gender fluid. I realize that the word Latinx may be unfamiliar to some readers, but I have learned that many young Latinx students favor this term, and I want to be as inclusive in my language as possible. Though used less often in this text, you will find that I have also replaced the terms Chicano or Chicana with the gender-inclusive term Chicanx for the same reasons. There are regional variations in the use of the terms Native American, American Indian, and Indian. American Indian and Native people are now more widely used than Native American, and the language I use in this edition reflects that shift. People of Asian descent include Pacific Islanders, and that is reflected in the terms Asian/Pacific Islanders and Asian Pacific Americans. However, when quoting others, I use whichever terms, spellings, and capitalizations they use. My dilemma about the language to use reflects the fact that race is a social construction. Despite myths to the contrary, biologists tell us that the only meaningful racial categorization is that of human. Vandenberg defines race as a group that is socially defined, but on the basis of physical criteria, end quote, including skin color and facial features. Racial identity development, a central focus of this book, usually refers to the process of defining for oneself the personal significance and social meaning of belonging to a particular racial group. The terms racial identity and ethnic identity are often used synonymously, though a distinction can be made between the two. An ethnic group is a socially defined group based on cultural criteria, such as language, customs, and shared history. An individual might identify as a member of an ethnic group, Irish or Italian, for example, but might not think of himself in racial terms as white. On the other hand, one may recognize the personal significance of racial group membership, identifying as Black, for instance, but may not consider ethnic identity, such as West Indian, as particularly meaningful. Both racial and ethnic categories are socially constructed, and social definitions of these categories have changed over time. For example, in his book Ethnic Identity, The Transformation of White America, Richard Alba points out that the high rates of intermarriage and the dissolution of other social boundaries among European ethnic groups in the United States have reduced the significance of ethnic identity for these groups. And in their place, he argues, a new ethnic identity is emerging, that of European American. Throughout this book, I refer to racial identity. It is important, however, to acknowledge that ethnic identity and racial identity sometimes intersect. For example, dark-skinned Puerto Ricans may identify culturally as Puerto Rican, and yet be categorized racially by others as Black on the basis of physical appearance. Culture is also an important part of one's sense of group membership, suggesting that what is referred to as racial identity is really more fully described as racial ethnic cultural REC identity, as will be discussed in Chapter 4. Whether speaking of racial or ethnic identity specifically, these identities remain most salient to individuals of racial or ethnic groups that have been historically disadvantaged or marginalized. The language we use to categorize one another racially is imperfect. These categories are still evolving, as changing census classifications indicate. The original creation of racial categories was in the service of oppression. Some may argue that to continue to use them is to continue that oppression. I respect that argument. Yet it is difficult to talk about what is essentially a flawed and problematic social construct without using language that is itself problematic. We have to be able to talk about it in order to change it. So this is the language I chose. So that was a lot, but I think so helpful, especially since the topic of social segregation is very timely right now. I found it very believable, and it made a lot of sense to me that children understood potentially as early as the age of 3 about stereotypes and had these in their minds. And then also the point about omission and what we have not been told. So like if we do not see Black authors or Black people in the media, that is we're just going to assume that there aren't any at a younger age or that there aren't very many. And I think that is probably where we've gotten the stereotype and bias that white people are more successful, which is statistically untrue. There are more educated Black people than there are educated white people in terms of education systemically. What else? The definitions I will be putting in the notes as well as the books and articles that were mentioned. If you want to look those up or add them to your Squarespace or whatever you use to keep track of things you would like to read. Yeah. And I did find when they were talking about white privilege and the white viewpoint, I did find that very interesting. I have had a pretty good understanding of white privilege for some time throughout my journey of deconstructing, but I had never quite thought of it in these terms before. And I really appreciated it. Like if I say something in a meeting or if I say something in a book or in a comment, it's not viewed as the white viewpoint. Like I am more often viewed as an individual instead of a group. And it's funny because I see so many things on social media, especially with white people and especially white men, I've noticed, but white women do it too, where they get very upset when Black people refer to them in terms of a group, like white people are. And they're like, why are you generalizing us? But not realizing that we have been doing that the entire time. Like we're most often systemically looked at as individuals rather than members of a racial group. And that's, I think, a really important piece to add. And, we hear all the time, like Black people aren't a monolith, Black women aren't a monolith. And some people want to come back and say, white people aren't a monolith either. Like, yeah, obviously. And then I'm going to put this in the notes as well as a potential journal prompt or something for us to think more about because I'm going to be thinking more about it. But it says, we all like to think that we deserve the good things we have received and that others too get what they deserve. And then the social psychologists call it belief in a just world and that racism contradicts that notion of justice. And I put in the margin, do I think this? Because I'm not sure. I don't think so, but I need to journal and think about that more. Like, are any of my actions or the thoughts in my head thinking I've gotten what I deserve in life and other people get what they deserve? And I said I don't think so because this reminds me of the pull yourself up by the bootstraps narrative, which I don't subscribe to, but I was taught that growing up that if you work hard, good things will come to you. And we know that's not the case realistically. I loved the analogy of the conveyor belt moving and that active or overt racism would be moving quickly, walking on that conveyor belt, very quickly, the people that are I must get to the other side. That's white supremacy, right? But then the people that are just standing there as all the people run past them, but they're not doing anything to go the opposite direction. They are passively racist because they are passively allowing these things to happen and not doing anything about it. And then to be actively anti-racist is to turn around and walk actively in the opposite direction at a faster speed than the conveyor belt, because that's the only way that you would get to the other side. Otherwise, you're going to be carried along with the others. That analogy was so powerful to me. My mind was blown. I put in the margins, I love this analogy with 3 exclamation points. I also like the to whom much is given, much is required line as a kind of recognition, but I just, for some reason, that line is powerful to me in terms of how we should be using our privilege for good. But yeah, like to whom much is given, like we have benefited from this for forever. I mean, since I was born, right? And since you were born. And so much is required of us. And too often, I think we run from that or choose the excuse of self care or protecting my peace. That is also a privilege. That is a benefit to be able to just turn it off at any time. And so I think that that is important for us to realize. Another one that I will put as a journal prompt is the story she was talking about and the student that interviewed the group of female college students. And while the women acknowledged their good fortune, none of them discussed their whiteness. They hadn't considered the possibility that being white had worked in their favor and helped give them the benefit of the doubt at critical junctures. And that reminded me of, I saw a video on social media yesterday where someone was talking about how they had lived a privileged life and they named multiple privileges, like growing up with a good family, multiple other things, but they didn't name whiteness. And I found that interesting after I just read this. That stood out to me. And then the targeted by multiple isms, like if you have, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, anti-Semitism, ageism, like in different combinations, that the effects of those isms and disadvantages are intensified or amplified. Yeah. And then so when she did the excerpt from the book by Wendell Berry, The Hidden Wound, who was the white writer raised in Kentucky and talking about the psychic pain of racism to white people. And he talks about, I'm just going to read it one more time for power because it was important to me. If white people have suffered less obviously from racism than Black people, they have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater perhaps than we can yet know. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon Black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or as a member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge it or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, as great a damage in his mind as it is in his society. And I put to that in the margin, is this why anti-racism work makes me feel more whole? Because although we shouldn't be doing it to benefit ourselves, I have frequently spoken about how since I started doing anti-racism work, I am a more content and confident and peaceful person, like inside. And so I felt that like it almost brought me like it made me feel like I'm healing in a way. And for a while, I thought it was just because like I almost made anti-racism work like a special interest. Like I was just reading everything I could and learning all of these things and listening to so many people. But then, that wore off and now it's just like a part of my routines. I mean, I still like actively stay engaged, but I've always said like it's interesting that I felt more whole and I wish more people could experience that. And so when I read this about the great wound that we carry when we don't speak about it, I couldn't help but think like, is that why? Is it because we have this wound that we have been carrying because of what we have benefited from, what we have perpetuated? When we start to work on repairing that, does it bring more healing to us? Also, I have definitely said non-white people multiple times in videos. And she talks about how that term is particularly offensive because it defines groups of people in terms of what they're not. And then when she said, do we call women non-men? I was like, mind blown. So I'm putting that in the notes as like something to stay mindful of, like things to try not to say. And then additionally, the term minorities, because that's so true. Like people of color are the global majority, not white people. We are not the global majority. And that's just a fact. And so I was like, that is so interesting. Like, why have I always said minorities? And I did think about that a little last night. And I think in the past, when I've used the term minorities, what I really was thinking or meant to say was marginalized or more marginalized than myself. But language matters. So I'm going to make an effort not to say those things because, yes, what if somebody called us non-men? That would be highly offensive. I'd be like, what? Yeah, I think that's about it. And being able to talk about it in order to change it. Like there is so many times, like, since I've been doing this work, and if you listen in conversations, when somebody says, like, if you listen to white people talk, how they will avoid at all costs, most white people, not all, obviously, most white people will avoid at all cost, like, describing someone by the words white or black. Like, why? Because they're not acknowledging it, and we have to speak about it in order to acknowledge it and then in order to change it. So I think that that's really important for us to think about. And then when you talk to Black people, how they're very quickly, like, I had a coworker I was talking to something about, and she was like wondering if I had talked to this other woman. And she was like, "Have you talked to?" And she was like, "I can't remember her name." And then she was like going on to describe her. And she was like, like, she's a Black woman. She was like, and she said the really funny things all the time in our meetings. And I was like, I know exactly who you're talking about. But I feel like if a white person was trying to explain the whole thing, they would have tried to explain her in every way, but saying she's a Black woman. And I find that just fascinating. So we'll learn more as we go through. For anyone that wants to join, chapter 2 is called The Complexity of Identity. Who am I? So I think that that will be really, really interesting, and I'm excited about it. I am going to be doing this because I'm reading this book anyways, so I'll be doing hopefully a video every day or two from this book until we finish it, every chapter. So you can either read along with me, listen to me if you're like working or driving and you prefer to listen to your books, or if you're listening to the audiobook or reading it on your own and you just want to hear the notes, I will put those in the description so you can just fast forward to the point in the video where I just talk about my thoughts. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Obviously, feel free to subscribe, of course, so we can have more conversations. I will be putting this up on Patreon, YouTube, unfortunately, just a snippet on any other social medias because they don't allow for longer videos. And yeah, we're going to move through it chapter by chapter and just learn more things. And I would love for you to come along in the journey with me. Yeah, thank y'all for joining. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And don't forget to do something good with your privilege. I have links in my link tree in the bio with a couple of the women that I learned from, the Black women that I learned from. So you can subscribe to their Patreons. That's the primary place that both of them are getting support and posting videos at this time. So you can just go there and scroll down, and there's a direct link that'll take you to subscribe. If you're not on Patreon, it's great. It takes a little bit to get used to, but once you do, most people love it, especially as a content user. It makes it very easy to see when your favorite creators have posted, and you can subscribe to Portia for $5 a month, I believe, is the lowest tier. White Woman Whisperer is about the same, but I subscribed for a year for like $50 or $55. So that's an option as well. So it won't be taken out of your account every month. It'll just be the one-time payment if you have the ability, which came in handy when I lost my job recently, because right now I am pretty poor, but I am able to still subscribe to Portia because of a paid subscriber that I have on my Patreon, and I'm able to still subscribe to White Moon Whisperer, Rebecca, because I bought the year membership, so I'm covered for a while. Anyways, I hope y'all have a lovely day. Goodbye.